Hi, thank you everyone so much for coming here. I realize that because we don't have the bridge and tunnel system, you have to brave the outside and the polar vortex. So thank you so much for coming today through all of that weather. We're actually quite happy today to have an arts-related talk today. Steve Laranga is a doctoral candidate in ethnomusicology at the University of Wisconsin. He studied at the STSI Music College in Central Java with an Indonesian government Dharma Siswa?
Yes.
Pretty good, huh? Fellowship. It's good that Bahasa you can do syllabically. And did his dissertation research in East Java under a Fulbright. His MA thesis dealt with Kampursari, a new Javanese music genre featuring fusion aesthetics, while his dissertation looks at the musical lives and economic realities of gamelan musicians and the Javanese and Madurese cultural mix in and around the city of Surabaya. This semester, he's the visiting musical director of the Gamelan, which will be holding its annual concert titled From the Palace to the Tent, a concert of classic and popular gamelan music and dance traditions of Java, to be held in Hill Auditorium at 7:30 on Monday, March 26. Please mark your calendars. Could you join me in welcoming Steve Laranga?
So thanks, Christiane, for inviting me to give this talk and for inviting me to the campus to teach gamelan for the semester. This paper is about, a lot of it is about arts patronage, and probably not many of you know that the gamelan program at the University of Wisconsin has been gone for a couple of years now. It's been kind of put on hiatus for a while. And so coming here, this paper is kind of a dark perspective on arts patronage, but coming here is really makes me appreciate arts patronage from the perspective of being enabled to actually do performances and practices and everything like that. So now onto the paper. I've traditionally introduced my discussions of the spectacularly staged performance of masculine largesse known as salabâdhân or sandur Madura by jumping right into a lengthy exercise in thick description. As someone who has made a long-term commitment to the study of some underrepresented musical traditions and trends in the East Javanese regions of Greater Surabaya and its neighboring island of Madura, I tend to assume that few members of my audience will have an intimate familiarity with such a particular and culturally marginalized subject matter. Above and beyond any theoretical aim, my top priority and source of satisfaction has always been to paint as rich a picture as I can of the core activities of these all-night parties that are exclusively sponsored and carried out by a loose syndicate of self-styled tough guys. But I got carried away while embellishing the opening narrative of today's presentation. So rather than making you sit through a long description of what goes on at this event, before I tell you why I'm bringing all of this up, I'll tell you up front this time what I aim to say in this paper before getting into the narrative. This is a paper about the actions, motivations, and especially the reputations of a particular group of arts patrons, who also happen to be seen by many Indonesians as a sort of mafia. Those of you who have devoted significant time to the study of Indonesian politics and society would be right in thinking that this will be a paper about the relationships of a particular kind of jago or preman, two of the most common Indonesian terms for street fighters or bad men, their relationship to the idea of tradition. These particular men are known in Madurese as blâtèr. I have found the question of why these men tie themselves so steadfastly to the salabâdhân performance tradition to be an extremely fertile one. It's a question that invites consideration of a whole range of culturally and politically important issues. These include how the cultivation of rumor and ill repute can serve as a means to amass power. How power can be expressed by filling public or communal spaces with spectacular displays of sound and light, and of displays of impunity to social and legal norms. How social obligations of recognition and reciprocity can function to produce and reproduce traditions without much need for desperate pleas that the youth ought to value their cultural legacies. How the value of tradition, which seems inevitably to lend a narrative of legitimacy to whatever actions fall under its aegis, can be employed to political ends. And to name just one more key concern for today, what kind of effect on local political life, especially local electoral politics, the real or rumored syndical actions of these traditionalist tough guys can have. This is a paper that tries to dive into the cultural politics of traditional performance in Java and Madura in a way that has not been done by many ethnomusicological studies of gamelan music traditions. It is a path that has been taken by numerous anthropologists and historians, including James Siegel, John Pemberton, and Laurie Sears, although most of their work has focused on the cultural centers of Central Java rather than the cultural periphery and economic center around the Madura Strait. I do not suggest that ethnomusicologists should expect to find this kind of lurid interplay of political clientelism and traditional performance everywhere in Java and Madura, although other examples are certainly out there awaiting critical inquiry, even in the exalted world of the classical gamelan traditions of Central Java's court cities. Rather, I argue here for a broader methodological imperative. Sponsored performances, whether by private individuals or larger institutions, continue to be the most common context for spectators to encounter traditional performing arts in person, and the most reliable kind of work for gamelan musicians and their onstage affiliates in Java and Madura. I hope to show through the fruitfulness of this line of inquiry into the patronage side of salabâdhân that any serious inquiry into the historical development of performing arts traditions, the source of endless laments by people of a preservationist bent for well over 100 years now, ought to take into close account the perspectives and concerns of the sponsors and how these factors might steer the changing and the crystallization of performing arts conventions. So now we get into the thick description part. It happens hundreds of times through the night, close to 100 nights a year, during large gatherings of local big men, or blâtèr, in contemporary Western Madura and in Madurese enclaves in mainland East Java, especially in and around the industrial metropolis of Surabaya. Just in case anybody isn't familiar with areas. Madura is the island here, and Surabaya is the big A there. So most of the Sandro Madura activity, or salabâdhân activity that I saw was in the city of Surabaya. But I also went to Bangkalan, where a lot of the musicians that I worked with lived there, and they would commute to Surabaya for performances. Now getting back to this account. The master of ceremonies, known as the babuto in Madurese or the tukang panggil in Indonesian, shouts into a microphone the honorific title and name of an invited male guest. Most often, he calls the man klebun, or village head. This is a cognate to the Javanese term klibon. The village head of his home locality in Surabaya, Madura, somewhere further afield in East Java, or if the man works in another city as far away as Jakarta or Singapore. This klebun may or may not be an actual elected village head. In this context, to be named as such is to be recognized as a big man or boss on a local or regional level. This is precisely what all of the guests at this party aspire and purport to be, and what many of them unambiguously are. Thus, somebody called Klebun Setopan Dupak, the boss of the Dupak intersection, this being the well-known location of Surabaya's scrap metal and secondhand goods markets in the heart of one of the city's largest Madurese enclaves. Another one is Klebun Singapura, the big man of Singapore. So these are titles that convey, or perhaps I should say assert, a man's power and place in or just outside of the world of official politics. This kind of party is known as a Remo, and its requisite form of music and dance entertainment is called salabâdhân or Sandur Madura. In its present form, salabâdhân is a night-long program devoted primarily to recognizing each of the big men who has a place in the Remo gathering. The MC or tukang panggil presides over this lengthy process. A small group of 7 or 8 gamelan musicians and the group's 2 cross-dressing singer-dressers called tanda or lenget need only a second or two to agree upon the appropriate piece of music to play in honor of the man who has been called up to stage. The guests are nearly all regulars in the Remo party circuit, and it is the responsibility of the musicians to know each man's preferred or appropriate song. I should mention, there are about 300 guests usually at these parties. That's kind of the standard number that people expect usually. So there are a lot of people that get called up in this process. The drummer plays a vigorous, syncopated introduction. The guest stands to begin walking toward the stage. Once the drummer can see the guest approaching, he sets into a forceful ostinato such that the man's stride seems to emanate a ferocious power. The walk may take up to a minute or so, since in crowded Surabaya, the long tents under which guests sit often stretch lengthwise for 100 meters or more along a narrow street. Hundreds of invited male guests, and nobody else, as this demarcated territory is exclusively theirs for the night, sit in clusters lining the two sides of the road on a weather-beaten tarpaulin, full of holes from the countless cigarette butts that have been extinguished on it during previous Remo parties. Unperturbed by the grittiness of the seating area, the clustered men leave a narrow aisle down the center through which a direct approach to the front of the tent can be made. As the guest closes in on the dance arena, a heavy drum flourish expresses the weightiness of this man now standing at the focal point of the gathering. He faces the two tanda, and behind them the gamelan musicians. The host, the record keeper, and the tukang panggil sit behind a low table a few meters off to his side. The entire gathering of invited guests is at his back. Not everyone is watching. In fact, most of the other guests are probably more interested in their own card games or conversations, or in drinking. This one I forgot to include earlier. Drinking large amounts of Guinness. That's the other thing that they do during these parties. No, it's actual Guinness. Okay. They're heavy drinkers. At these gatherings, these men drink quite a bit. But the important thing is that they could be watching very closely as this klebun presents himself in front of his many social peers. The man may be dressed in the iconic Madurese martial arts suit, the pesat, the officially recognized traditional men's wear of several districts in the region. Also known as klambi sakera style clothing, this loose-fitting suit, usually black, with its distinctively jagged tailoring and many hidden pockets for money, playing cards, phone, and who knows what other party essentials, was the favorite costume of the mytho-historical, violently rebellious late colonial sugar foreman, Sakera. The iconography of this celebrated, ruthless folk hero, or perhaps I should say bad man anti-hero, figures large in pop cultural representations of Madurese tradition and character. And much of his iconography is carried within the folds of the pesat martial arts suit. Later in this paper, we will have more to say about how the blâtèr tough guys manipulate the iconography of Sakera and stereotypes of the Madurese in crafting their own reputations. We may as well note briefly that other people play extensively with this iconography too, such as soccer fans. Only a few men wear pesat in the urban setting of the Surabaya Remo parties that I have attended most often. Those who do usually downplay its theatricality, wearing a plain white tank top or undershirt beneath the jacket, not the bold red and white striped, it's called a kaos bengalan, a brave man's t-shirt of the officially recognized traditional costume. Many of the urban blâtèr prefer more universal symbols of street credibility, dark leather top coats and tall black felt kopia hats. These hats being an outsized sibling of the patriotic caps called peci that were popularized in the time of Indonesia's first president, Sukarno. Or they may wear a Madurese-style odang, a pricey piece of headwear that is made to look like a bandana, but is actually constructed of a heavy leather strap that has been laminated with smooth batik fabric and then coated in a shiny, transparent resin. Blâtèr use their money conspicuously, and a quality odang costs well over $100. But their guests dress just as many, other guests dress just as many thousands of Surabaya men do every day for their routine outings, wearing weathered t-shirts or button-downs and work pants. Once the guest is squarely in the center of the dance arena, he may immediately approach the party host in order to exchange formal greetings and give the host a substantial cash gift called a bubuan. This is a Madurese cognate word for the Javanese term bubuhan. So there's a similar concept in Javanese culture of this type of gift. From a ceremonial standpoint, this moment of exchange and mutual recognition is the defining moment of the entire evening. the ostensible and perhaps actual main reason for the guests' attendance at the Remo gathering. But rather than immediately approaching the host, the guest may instead choose to dance briefly with the tanda for a round of the song first. If he does so, the gamelan follows his lead. The drummer adapts continuously to his movements, launching into one of many virtuosic dance rhythms before signaling the musicians to play quietly when the guest steps over to talk with the host. The musical interplay is not totally spontaneous, but the range of suitable music and dance possibilities at this moment is very broad. The song continues in relatively muted tones as the guest greets host while leafing bills into a tray, in clear view of the other guests. The act of exchange immediately becomes a focal point if anything unusual happens. But in my experience, all usually goes as expected, and only casual attention is paid to the interaction. I should note that in this particular one, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. This man is the chief of police for all of East Java, the man who's giving money there. And then the guy here is a candidate for the district head in Bangkalan, in the westernmost district of Madura. So this one people are paying attention because they're both really important people. And it's kind of, we'll talk about that more at the end of the paper. Where was I now? The amount of the gift is written in a logbook by the record keeper, and then the host dumps the money into a large bucket or box. In 2012 and 2013, by my visual estimation, a typical gift was 500,000 rupiah, or about $50, although some guests gave far more than that, and a few gave as little as 200,000. The amount of the gift is not always visually obvious, as a guest may deliver the bupuan gift of other men who were invited to the Remo but could not attend. After this brief exchange, the guest turns again towards the tanda singer-dancers, both of whom are clad in traditional women's kabudja blouses or kabaya and exquisite batik sarong, looking, at least to my eye, more like respectable matrons of means than like tempting dance sirens. This may stem from a lack of young people taking up the profession. It's something that the tanda that I knew complained about this a lot. These two tanda that I spoke with often, or the two right here, are both nephews of the manager and owner of the group that is engaged exclusively for performances in Surabaya, and they're both well into their 40s. They were not developing any prodigies at the time of my research in 2012 and 2013. During the second brief round of dance, the tanda face back toward the gamelan, their backs to the congregated guests. The guest faces the tanda and the audience behind them. He stuffs smaller cash gifts called tapalan into their blouses. He might theatrically pluck numerous small bills out one by one from a wad, or give them in alternation to the true professional singer-dancers. On one occasion that I saw, a guest draped long garlands of bills, that's this picture, that had been taped together over the shoulders of the dancers. The guest may choose to dance for another cycle or two of the song, or he may quickly give the cash and duck out. One of the two tanda sings, drawing mainly from a wealth of memorized short paparegan, in Javanese this would be parian or pantun poetic texts. The other may stand passively or sway gently, playing the role of feminine target for the guest's display of masculine prowess. Sometimes the dancing tanda will mirror a male movement style as a means of casually coaching a guest in the dance style. The guest prepares to leave the dance arena by taking a quick step backwards into a slight bowing position and then extending his arms so as to politely cut between the two tanda, moving forward through the center of the dance floor and back into the seating area. The drummer immediately signals the other musicians to stop playing as soon as the guest begins making his exit, an abrupt cue that often ends the song in the middle of a melodic phrase. Within a few seconds, just long enough for the musicians to have a sip of coffee or light up a cigarette, the tukang panggil shouts out the next name on his list. Resounding again and again until morning, until hundreds of guests have been called up to meet with the host and hundreds of millions of rupiah have been exchanged, the powerful rhythms and voices of the musicians at the Remo party acknowledge the importance of each guest who shows himself in front of his peers, and give to neighbors and passers-by a stridently audible measure of the powerful presence of this rugged and resilient Madurese subculture. So now finally you can see it. It'll take you about a fifth of the time, probably about a tenth of the time to watch this video that it took me to describe it. Oops, sorry. Walking up to the stage, I was more interested in the music than the walking. Things that happens like 300 times. Few different songs, but that's pretty much what most of the night is like. And I wanted to show you I mentioned about these sort of important people who are up next to the dance arena area. This is the host of the party. He actually is a village head, so he's a kalurahan, a neighborhood head in Surabaya. Not all of them are, but this particular one is. This is the record keeper for the Remo organization, and then this is the tukang panggil, the MC of the event. So they all the kind of main, the important people in the organization, they're all sitting right up there next to the still sort of stage area. Well, actually, I'm going to leave on that one. So by now, I imagine that some of you are thinking that this sounds a little like Clifford Geertz, or at least I hope so, for a few reasons. First is, of course, that if it sounds like that, there's a good chance that it's a compelling story. Beyond that, though, ever since I began to learn about the Remo social scene in 2012 and to think about why these men so steadfastly support the salabâdhân tradition, I have been struck over and over again by strong parallels with the kinds of social meaning and social jockeying that Geertz describes so vividly in his famous Balinese cockfight article. As Geertz would have it, men put a little of their reputations on the line, even the reputations of their families and neighborhoods, every time they bet on a fighting bird. The blâtèr, who sponsor Remo parties, are widely reputed as boundless enthusiasts of a wide range of blood sports, wagering on battles that pit anything from bulls to crickets to electoral candidates against each other. But gambling is just a background entertainment when salabâdhân is happening. When a guest at a Remo party dances, it is very easy to see in the spread eagle posture and in the hands quivering with energy, something like the puffed feathers of a rooster that shows his readiness for a fight. No one ever explained the dance to me this way. Such clear symbolic explications were rarely offered throughout the time of my field research in Surabaya, which was a striking and at first confusing contrast to my past experiences in the central Javanese court cities of Surakarta and Yogyakarta, where I always found that exegesis was like constantly happening in the central Javanese cities. However, a few people in the salabâdhân scene accepted this idea as a reasonable interpretation when I suggested it. Symbolic violence is carried out much more explicitly during some optional comedic scenes in salabâdhân performances, which more often than not are omitted because so much time is required to call all of the guests individually up to greet the host. The clearest example that I've seen is the extraordinarily rough humor of a dance called rancap, tari rancap, in which a comedian/martial artist alternates between telling caricaturish narratives of pillages in faraway locales and demonstrating lethal attack moves using a variety of sharp weapons as he leaps around the performance arena to grab the small denominations of money that the blâtèrs have given him in appreciation. I have a video of this, but I couldn't make it go into my PowerPoint, so rather than closing PowerPoint, I think I'll save it until the end if we have time for that. Today, at least, serious conflicts at Remo parties are rarer than one might expect based on the lore of Madurese tough guys, a set of vicious stereotypes that I believe works as a form of underground social capital to buttress the reputation of the blâtèrs as men who are not to be trifled with. I never saw a fight or even a serious argument in any of the time I spent around these self-styled bad men. But a few written accounts have been made of confrontations that occurred at the heightened moment when a man presents himself before the gathered assembly. There is a disturbing story of a shooting incident that Ellie Tohen-Bosma, I think that she's an anthropologist, witnessed while conducting research for what became the first post-colonial ethnographic account of Remo networks, her 1983 article called Madura, the Sicily of Java. It's written with a question mark. Anthropologist A. Latif Wiata, in his 2001 study of the infamous Madurese practice of charok, the deadly duels that a man may initiate when he or his family has been severely dishonored, notes that the accepted reasons for initiating such a mortal confrontation are codified among blâtèr. Most common are adultery and egregiously unpaid personal debts, a clear sign of disrespect if there ever was one, the unpaid debt thing that goes on forever. According to Wiata, there is a common understanding that the penalty for killing somebody in a charok is 12 years jail time. A blâtèr may even, by this account, convene a special Remo party in order to fundraise for his family on the eve of his being locked up. So I'm describing this as lore just as much as it is a reality. And it's kind of it's a big part of the reputation of these men that they have all of these rules about how you'd go about having a duel with somebody. But I've never gotten to the bottom of how often any of this actually happens. What is assuredly true, that's what I just said, is that it is a body of lore that establishes the fearsome reputation of the blâtèr class of men as a dangerous elite within the informal politics of the street and the neighborhood. I suggest that these men play a long game of high stakes by committing to present themselves to their affiliative peers, the other blâtèr, dozens of times every year, and to bring a large cash gift with them every time, not to mention the significant surplus of money that should be given to the dancers and the Salabadhan group. Much of the money will come back to them once they have attended enough gatherings to be able to host a Remo party that all those who receive their gifts will be obligated to attend. But the pressure to have large amounts of cash on hand to be given away every time that you're invited to one of these parties is tremendous. As a means to advance their social reputations and their standing within the informal blâtèr syndicate, men place themselves in a lifelong web of debt relationships, a rotating credit society writ large, or, to use the Indonesian term, a high-rolling arisan mutual savings club. And there's a lot of proverbs and poetic verses and things that are relevant to this, but this is one that I always think is a good one. The first two lines don't really relate to the second two lines. But this is, definitely the kind of an ethos among the blâtèr group of men. One last point relating to Geert's now almost 50-year-old Balinese cockfight article. It's been roundly criticized over the years for its egregious essentializing, its flattening out of the plurality of worldviews held by the Balinese people, and its use of the ethnographic present mode of representation to richly analyze a synchronic system at the cost of ignoring questions of how it came to be that way. Throughout my fieldwork experience in Surabaya, and especially throughout my experience talking with people about salabâdhân, or as people actually more often called it, sandur Madura, I was very much aware of how limited my perspective was on the topics I chose to pursue. Most of my primary information came from only a handful of musicians and cultural officials who were in one way or another tied closely to this scene. The very same people, by the way, who were interviewed for the few other substantial reports on the tradition that have been written by Indonesian researchers in the past 20 years or so. This discourse is thus a bit of an echo chamber. I never had more than a brief, genial introductory conversation with any of the blâtèr sponsors, who seemed to live up to their reputation of being a closed and rather secretive group. Yet I have met few people whose primary loyalty was to typo here. I've also met few people whose primary loyalty was to Islamic teachers and religious leaders. Most of the people I was hanging around with were not blâtèr, but they were also not kind of the majority of Madurese people who are mainly allied to the mosque officials and religious educators. That's probably a pretty large majority of Madurese people. I was kind of with this small group of syncretic religious Madurese. That's a pretty small minority there. I've spoken with enough Santri Madurese people, however, to know that few of them feel much admiration towards the blâtèr subculture, although they recognize it as a formidable faction in Madurese society and politics that cannot simply be ignored. There were many topics that I felt I could not breach in conversation. How much money was shared by members of the Salabadhan group, whether the blâtèr tough guys were really a kind of mafia as they were reputed to be, how often violence actually occurred among the blâtèr, and so on. Many other questions that I asked never seemed to be answered squarely. And I just give one example of this is when a man named Mat Bonang, who was the Surabaya Salabadhan group's senior-most musician and my closest acquaintance in this scene, quipped ruefully that we only play 7 songs all night long. That's all that we ever do in the current form of sandur Madura or salabâdhân. I asked him whether there was any special significance to the choice of song that is played for a particular guest. The answer from him and from others in the group was an unelaborated no. The group actually played just a little more than 7 songs. Just in case anybody is a music specialist, I've listed the songs there. Most of them are exist in some form in both Madurese and Javanese music styles. But all of the musicians complained about the extremely hard work, playing at a full bore, non-stop for 8 hours or more, playing a couple of workhorse songs upwards of 50 times on any given night. Those ones are Jula Juli and Sabrang. Those ones, they just play them over and over again. I developed a convincing narrative for myself that perhaps the various songs were associated with different rankings or levels of seniority or with different home territories of the guests. I won't go into my full reasoning here. Suffice to say that I could not get anyone I talked with to engage this question. There may have been something concealed here, as it was an acknowledged truth that the entire Remo scene, following a set of protocols laid out by their formal association of blâtèrs, had changed quite dramatically in the 1970s, and that one of those changes was to flatten out the hierarchy in the organization that had reportedly led to many personal conflicts. But it's also completely possible that this was simply a probe for deep meaning that didn't hit upon anything resonant. I chose to use the present tense in my earlier description of the key event in Salabadhan, the calling up of invited guests to ceremoniously greet the host, because there is such a strong sense of conventionality to the process as it's practiced today. All of the Remo parties that I attended, and the many commercial video recordings that I purchased, proceeded with the most minimal variations in structure. Salabadhan's present form is in fact a product of the 1970s. It's perhaps better described as a set of protocols that were developed by senior blâtèr in response to the particular problems that they faced at that time. Information on Salabadhan conventions prior to that is sketchy. But by both written and oral accounts, it was a more varied and often much longer affair, a full day long, like a 24-hour long day, or even could go into multiple days. It incorporated numerous segments of dance, comedy, music, dramatic performances portraying domestic life over the course of a full day or more. It was not yet the exclusive traditional entertainment form of the blâtèrs, but could rather be sponsored for weddings and festivals as well. Remo associations of local big men were relatively small, and the groups were small, and there were many of them in number. As the story goes, in the wake of the widespread violence of President Suharto's accession of power in late 1960s Indonesia, two major changes impacted upon the continuity of the Salabadhan tradition, which around this time came to be more commonly called Sandur Madura. One was a rise in the power of religious authorities in Madura, who it seems were successful in driving the distinctly non-pious Salabadhan tradition to the edges of society. Most likely, it was because religious authorities disapproved of the use of the pious Arabic-derived term salabâdhân, which literally means something like supplicating to God, as the name of an essentially secular and vain form of entertainment that motivated the shift to calling it Sandur Madura. And then the second big change was that agonistic relationships between the smaller Remo circles, there were many of them at that time, led to a spate of violence. This probably kind of was generated by the general violence that was happening in the late 60s. Eventually, a sort of truce among local big men throughout that whole region of northern East Java was made on the condition that they joined together in the creation of just a few very large Remo associations that, as I mentioned before, kind of would get rid of a lot of the hierarchy that used to be more important. Today there are only 3 such circles. The one based in Surabaya that I spent a lot of time with. That particular one also has branches in Malang and Jakarta. So every once in a while the musicians that I was with I didn't ever go to see it, but they would like travel to Jakarta to do the same thing with the same group of people in a totally different city. The other two circles are in the westernmost district in Madura, Bangkalan, and then the neighboring district of Sampang. Hence the genesis of the 300-guest Remo party, and the sudden obligation for participants to attend multiple Remo parties every week. With so many members of the circle, there's going to be these parties. People are going to be throwing these parties all the time, and the blâtèr end up spending like a couple of nights every week going to these Remo parties. As a result of this situation, Sandur Madura proceedings were reduced to their essentials, which in the eyes of the blâtèrs meant focusing on the process of formally recognizing and making gift exchanges with guests. This is why Salabadhan musicians today play the same 7 songs, great songs by the way, over and over again for 8 or more hours at a time. I don't want to get too far into the exceedingly complicated and elusive topic of the history of Sandur Madura, Salabadhan, and Remo parties, but it is worth mentioning that descriptions of performances bearing some general resemblance to contemporary Madurese Sandur or Salabadhan, these ones were called Salabadhan in the old sources, date back to at least around 1850. In the picaresque tale of local tough guy in Bangkalan, Tanda Anggrek, this story was preserved by Dutch linguist A.C. Vrede in his 1878 collection of Madurese folk tales entitled Cerita Brakai. The Tanda Anggrek story includes a brief account of a problem that occurred during the building of a grand mosque in Bangkalan. The builders found it impossible to dig holes for its central pillars in the ground. After consulting with local experts in the story, the builders concluded that the ground and the local spirits needed to be supplicated by way of a Salabadhan party in the place where the mosque would stand. This is a narrative setup that I believe is told in many variants and in many locales across Java and Madura. A party ventured out to look for performers, eventually coming upon a group of young goat herders who were also itinerant musicians and transvestite dancers. They were hired to perform on the mosque grounds, and lo and behold, the building process went smoothly after that. Presumably, all this would have taken place hundreds of years prior to the recording of the Tanda Anggrek story. So, in the time when actually, I didn't have time to look up when the first grand mosque was built in Bakalan, but probably the 16th or 17th century. This is about the best explanation that I've heard of the religious provenance of the genre name salabâdhân, and taken metaphorically of the long-standing relationship of agonism and interdependence between religious and morally transgressive popular factions in the politics of the region. Now, in the political present of what we often call post-Reformasi Indonesia, post-2000 roughly, this tradition seems to have taken on a new importance under the name of Sandur Madura. A number of unprecedentedly incisive accounts of the genre, mostly oriented towards its social organization and its sponsors' political influence, have been published in the years since Wiyada's book on Charok revenge attacks that I mentioned earlier. Arifin Mansurnur's classic 1987 study of Madure's politics as a perennial struggle of elected and appointed officials or bureaucrats versus the local traditionalist Islamic religious elite has been updated during the post-Reformasi era to include a third key power player who doesn't fight fair, the blâtèr underworld. How did this happen? I suggest, along with Abdur Razaki, another scholar who's asked this question most insistently, that it relates directly to the nationwide process of decentralization or regional autonomy that has been one of the most striking Indonesian political developments since 2000. In short, regional autonomy has greatly increased the stakes of local politics, and in many cases, the size of local politicians' access to local natural resources and other sources of wealth. For years, I've wondered how to raise the subject matter of the blâtèr syndicate's concrete participation in local politics. So thick is this world with shadowy rumors of conspiracy, black-clad men who do bad things at night, and of voters' claims of systematic intimidation efforts from the very officials who oversee their own polling stations. In very general terms, I think it is fair to assume that the blâtèr, or at least those blâtèr who truly lead the thug life, function in a way very similar to that of the blood-chillingly ruthless preman, whose life we can see in excruciating depth in Joshua Oppenheimer's 2012 documentary, The Act of Killing. Probably a lot of you probably have seen that. They own businesses, but they are also known to extort money from their clients, be those clients market vendors or their own employees. They take bribes. They use divisive scare tactics to seek local public office, and then they take full financial advantage of the power of this position. Unfortunately, the blâtèrs enjoy quite a bit more success with running for office than does the goofball preman candidate in Oppenheimer's film. But all of this is so shadowy and insinuating. How does one address it without relying on stereotypes and delving into conspiracy theories? So, luckily, we now have an ideal case study in the person of Ra Fuad Amin, who's the man right here, the district head or bupati of Bangkalan from 2003 to 2013, a man of known descent from Madura's holiest of Islamic teachers, Kiai Kholil, and as of September 2017, the biggest catch in that Indonesia's Corruption Eradication Commission, or KPK, has ever made. So you can see here, this is when they went into his office and they found all of the cash that he had hidden. Oh, are we out? Well, there's not much. Let me see if I can I'll try to go. So Ra Fuad is now serving 13 years in jail after having been caught with roughly ₹500 billion rupiah, or $50 million in money gained through corruption. Among his most illustrious schemes was that he was engaged in a decade-long battle with East Javanese Governor Sukarwo over his claim of personal ownership of a large swath of extremely valuable government land that is slotted to be developed into one of Indonesia's largest industrial parks. This land, the value of which skyrocketed upon the completion of the Suramadu Bridge, the bridge that connects Surabaya and Madura, that was finished in 2008, is the first part of Madura that you pass through after making the crossing in a car or on a motorcycle. proposals for the development have ranged from a state-of-the-art microchip plant, which could be tremendously profitable, but drew local protests because it would draw in a highly educated workforce originating from outside of Madura, to the other main option, a giant cement factory that would provide local jobs but would have devastating environmental impact. Ra Fuad seems to have accepted money from all sides in his efforts to profit from the whole range of business suitors. Drawing upon his religious pedigree and strengthening his underworld connections by joining the Bangkalan Remo circle, Fuad Amin put considerable effort into cultivating an image of himself as Madura's first ever blâtèr Kiai, while serving as district head. In other words, he tried to take over all three big power player factions in Madura. And he succeeded in being re-elected in 2008, even though he was very unpopular in the population, and he succeeded in getting his son elected to follow him when his term limit ran out in 2013. The 2013 election campaign involved the blâtèr syndicate, and rumors of their illegal actions in spectacularly ugly fashion. The father and son carefully planned to simultaneously hold Ramomon's wedding and the son's wedding and his initiation into the Remo Association on a single weekend, a few months prior to the election. It is unusual for a man to enter the Remo scene by hosting a party rather than by attending many parties and establishing oneself as a lender in debt relationships first, but in this case, the powerful Ra Fuad was able to hand his own debt relations down to his son. My wife and I attended the unusually lavish Remo party, at which virtually all of the guests went all out and dressed in their formal Pesat suits. The event was televised on the regional East Javanese broadcaster, JTV, just the second time that they had ever shown a full performance of Sandur Madura. The first was, of course, an earlier Remo party held by Ra Fuad himself. The police chief of this is the guy I showed in the picture earlier. The police chief of East Java attended as a special guest, giving a speech in which he exhorted the blâtèr to carry on their traditions, but to do so without all of the rabble-rousing. The police chief then had the honor of being the first man called up to dance, during which time he dished a thick wad of 100,000 rupiah notes onto Ra Momon's money tray. We estimated it to be at least $2,000, an especially large amount considering that the police chief was not a member of the Remo Association, meaning that he would not be repaid for his gift, at least not through the usual ceremony of a salabâdhân performance. The weekend did not endear Ra Momon to any of the people that I knew, but it apparently did bring him the loyalty of the blâtèr. Weeks later, the election office of Momon's election opponent, located in a wing of the city's most sacrosanct Kiai Kolil Mosque, was burned down in an arson attack. The Suramadu bridge was shut down by a mass of people in protest, or perhaps in an effort by the blâtèrs to intensify the sense of crisis. No one could say for sure, but everyone knew that the election was going to be fixed. And in the end, Ra Momon won, despite cries of unprecedented levels of voter intimidation and refusals by election officials to accept voters' registrations as valid. Today, Ra Momon continues to preside as the second blâtèr Kiai district head, even as his father sits hundreds of miles away in prison.
Time for questions. And all these, one for me, Steve, how did you get access?
It's easy to get access to through the musicians. I could have talked to the blâtèr more, probably, if I had really pushed it, but it's really easy to get access through kind of the normal cultural channels. Yeah.
So as you were there, were you a watcher of things, or did you participate?
I watched and played. I sat with the musicians, or else right next to where the musicians were. I didn't sit in the area where the actual blâtèr sponsors sat. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Steve. This is fascinating. It reminds me of my one kind of contact with this form, the Remo form. It was in East Java in 1960s at a Katopa performance in which this was inserted, the Remo was inserted into it. And there was kind of a shiver through the audiences. Ooh, this is really bad. and a thrill about its badness. And I was wondering if that's still true and if that's part of the appeal.
With people in the neighborhood, definitely. The kids who watch it, that's why I always notice that a lot of little kids, just like at any music performance in Java, there's a lot of little kids will always be watching it and kind of really freely, like, you know, getting really close to the stage and doing pretty much whatever they want. And the little kids really like to dress up in those pesat suits, and they like to, there's a particular way that the tukang panggil, the MC, calls out everybody's name. So he shouts them really loud. He'll go like, what did I say? He's saying Klebun Singapura. He'll say like, he'll go like, Klebun Singapura. It's very like as strong a voice as he can do. Like, he's really old, the MC that I was showing you, so he doesn't have that strong of a voice. But all of the kids imitate that style of speaking. They call each other Klebun. So yeah, there's definitely a glamorization of that, even though people are also afraid of the.
Yeah, yeah. It's got a real frisson.
Yeah.
About it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned commercial videotapes. What's the market? Who buys
That's a
this?
good question, actually. I almost included that in the original talk. The market is the blâtèr. It's like a record. It's similar to a wedding video.
Okay.
So you get them to have evidence that of all of these people coming to your house, and they're available in the market though. And people, you know, some people will have people who like it might buy one, but they just kind of randomly choose them. They're all almost the same. The videos are all even the same people. It's like pretty much 2/3 of the guests are the same every time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the small gamelan ensemble always a feature of it, or are there ever kind of like budget events where there's maybe like a Casio keyboard with
There's a different type of party actually that is a different type of Madurese arisan that's called a to'oto.
Yeah.
That one doesn't need to be as formal, and it doesn't really bestow any honor on the people. So the having it be something that's prestigious in this particular context, it requires having the whole setup with the musicians and the dance.
And that's the only entertainment. There's no like.
There's gambling.
Secondary stage.
Gambling is the other entertainment.
Yeah. And also, I see in this picture, I see some women in the background. Is that really unusual because this was a different event? Because in the other pictures, it seems like obviously women aren't participating, but like, do they attend?
Women attend a lot. There's actually a couple of different ways that women attend these. This one is different because this had like the media presence. There was a female television host who was right in the middle of the whole thing because she was, you know, describing it as it was going on. But typically there's a space off to the actual arena where the guests sit is, you know, it's really delineated. It's just this specific area, and anybody can come to the edge of that. You just can't sit actually on the tarp or on the carpet that the blâtèr are sitting on. So all of the spectators will be just like gathered around the edges of the sort of arena itself. And the other thing that is really conventional in this, I don't know if it's required that blâtèr be married and have a family, but they pretty much all are. And they usually have a special place next to the table where the MC and the record keeper and the host sit. It's like the only area that has a carpet is this area for the wife and female relatives of the host of the party. So it's a really striking contrast because in the ones in Surabaya, this one is in Bangkalan and it's fancier than any of the other ones that I went to, but all of the men are sitting on that beaten up old tarp. They're all dusty, and the women have this thick, like kind of Persian looking rug that they're sitting on it. But it's only 8 or 10 women that are relatives of they're the only ones that are allowed to actually sit in the performance area itself. Yeah.
Is this a competitive setting? Are people competing in the way they present themselves and the way that and the amount of money they give, such that relationships might change from before to after?
In the long term, not so much like on a single occasion, but when you give somebody, if a guest gives the host a certain amount, and then when it eventually comes time for the host to return it, they give that much plus a certain amount more. That's sort of up to them, but
it's sort of a one-to-one between the host.
With a little bit
and
of inflation as
the
it goes on.
individual. It's not the individual against the other individuals.
Right. But there's something that happens that I didn't describe here. You know, some of the people who do this are just aspiring to be wealthy. They're not wealthy when they start doing it. And they end up having to borrow money in order to pay they borrow money, like, you know, really borrow money with interest and everything.
Well, it could sort of be an investment. You invest in me, I will present it, and then I will hold my own, and all this money will come back into me.
So these smaller groups form still within the larger group of like 300 men. There'll be these small groups of like 15 or 20 men who have a leader, and if one of them can't pay the debt, they would tend to go to the leader of their small group and ask him to cover them for that particular party or something like that. And then, you know, after a while, they become beholden to that person. And yeah, so the clientelism really comes out of that more than anything.
Thank you.
I have another question. You know, it's the first one you had the picture of the long line, some people waiting to come in, and there you have the arena. So, is there people are all seated, and when you're dancing in front of your peers, basically.
Yeah.
So is there not in that case apparently because they're still.
This is before it really started. So this is how they arrive. They arrive in the men arrive in these groups, and they kind of make a formal entrance.
Okay. So is there a competition for dance prowess, and are there sort of calls of admiration, or if someone blows it, do people?
No, not very much.
Or if someone does something really cool.
The only thing that I really saw much recognition for was there were a couple of people who had idiosyncratic songs that they chose. Like there was one guy, I don't know how much you know of Javanese music, but there was one guy who always wanted to have like jaranan music. He didn't want to have normal gamelan music. He wanted to have this like processional type of music called jaranan, where has a totally different dance style than this, and people enjoyed it when he did that. But he was an exception.
Do people voice their enjoyment? Are they sitting there quietly, or do they go wow, or is there?
Mostly they don't pay a lot of attention. Mostly, the really prominent people in the group go early in the night. So, especially after the first half hour or so, there's like.
And then do they leave?
Not a lot of some leave, and others. A lot of them like to stay all night, and they talk business also while the thing is going on. So a lot of them stay, and I don't know what they talk about exactly, but they talk about, you know, I didn't get into the sort of daytime careers of a lot of the blâtèr, but oftentimes they're like in charge of sort of transportation networks and things like that within Surabaya. So some of them work at the harbor, and they deal with transportation of wood, things like that. Like these really unglamorous industries, but they can make a lot of money doing it, and especially by supposedly take bribes for wood smuggling and things like that. So they'll allow their friends to get through for money, and they get into these kinds of positions where they're able to. I mean, it's a lot like those kind of small crimes that mafias in the U.S. do. Yeah.
So I'm just trying to figure out how the aesthetics works in terms of the whole sort of social setting. So you have like some music, you have singing, you have these dance, right? So individually and in combination, how do they work in terms of the creation of these, or recreation or representation of these social relationships? Is it just like background, the aesthetics? Is it ornamental? Is it part of, because those individuals, when they go up, they have to do a little dance, right?
Mm-hmm.
The crossfit and all of that. Is it a necessary gatekeeping thing, some of that, to actually sort of do the rest of it? I mean, how
it's not
does it-
because there's no obligation to do the dance. The obligation is to go and greet the hosts. The dance is sort of an extra that probably over half of them do the dance, but there's quite a few participants who just go right up and they go right back, and the song will only take like 30 seconds because they're not really interested in that part of it. So that's definitely not a requirement. I think that the aesthetic part of it, or I don't know if it's aesthetic so much as it's kind of a combination of aesthetic and the social aspect of the noise. Is just that they're occupying neighborhoods and doing this very aggressive stuff all night long. The music itself is on the aggressive end for music in Java. Yeah, and I think it's an aesthetic kind of show of force in that way. I got interested in it actually because I was kind of drawn to the powerfulness of the sound of it. It really, it was just such a contrast to what almost any other kind of music that you would hear in Java, except maybe for some of that like jaranan or reog or these types of processional musics. So I got interested in the aesthetic. There was a person who wrote a paper about the aesthetic of the singing, which he says is a combination of this kind of brave sound and usually it sounds melancholy. According to, he did interviews with people that said that the vocal style is of the female, men singing this, or transvestite men who are singing this, but they're singing in a female style. And I guess that the most of the musicians and audience members that this particular researcher talked to said that they felt that the mood of the female singing style was sort of melancholy. Yeah.
So is there any reason why you'd be singing songs
They're
of
all white.
melancholy repeatedly at this kind of a social event?
I can only tell you
These kinds of
that there's a
social
cliche
events?
kind of answer to that, is that's associated with this kind of cliche that goes that's what women's souls are like in Madura, supposedly. They're supposed to be melancholy. And then it goes further than that and says that actually in their hearts men also are like women. They also have these melancholy souls. So the toughness is, I guess they kind of probably would, if you really pushed it, people would probably admit that the toughness is kind of a shell for this inner melancholy. Yeah.
It's like the title to a monograph.
Right. The middle of the gamelan, the souls of the spirit.
Yeah.
Is there some sort of Central Javanese gamelan tradition coexisting here, or not at all?
They play some Central Javanese music in this, a few pieces, like they play ladrang pankur and they play srapagan. I don't know if
And
it's,
where do they learn those pankur? Is that
they play Pachokro songs actually, now that I think about it. They
well,
play
I wondered because
Ronda Malam
there
is
was Ronda Malam,
one of their
that's a
big songs,
Pachokro
yeah.
song. Oh, so they are in contact with.
Oh, they're in a lot of contact. Like one of them is a big critic of one of the older musicians. Not there were two really senior musicians in the group that I spent time with, and one of them, he was a very attentive listener, radio listener. He listened to Erori Solo and he listened to Erori Surabaya.
Ah, okay.
I think all of them did, and they all have experience playing Campur Sari. Most of them also do, so they definitely have a direct exposure to a lot of light. They mostly play this Madurese style of arrangements and songs, but they'll also do jobs playing Javanese, lighter Javanese styles of music, especially weddings in Madura.
Weddings, some of this stuff wouldn't go.
No, not unless it's like a gangster wedding. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out the economics of this, and interested in sort of how you get on the list and who decides, how many of these you decide to go to, and if everybody's doing this, and I can imagine everybody sort of breaks even, but that can't be it, right? Everybody's not holding these. All members aren't holding all these. So how does this sustain itself, right? It's at some level, sort of seems like a big pyramid scheme where
I think
the bottom fight at the end of the day.
It's not really a pyramid scheme. It's sort of like an inefficient system where there's always these losses that are happening because there's some debts that don't get paid. There's some people that disappear or they die or something, and so there's a little bit of inefficiency to the system. Ideally, it would kind of just grow with inflation, and it would kind of be you would just end up the same. In a way, it's better than keeping money in the bank in Indonesia because usually you have to pay a fee, a monthly fee to have a bank account too. But I think that probably the perks of it come through the social capital and the connections that people make. It kind of would give you access to this kind of gray economy of Surabaya.
So these are seen really as loans, not as gifts, right? These are not like wedding gifts. These are.
I think that they wouldn't. There's not really any differentiation between a gift and a loan. I didn't get into any of the anthropological gift exchange literature, but I've read a lot of it since I started doing this. And that, I mean, that seems to be common in a lot of gift-giving traditions, where the burden of receiving a gift is heavy. Yeah.
One quick question: the host, the person who's the host of the party, though, is paying for all of the Guinness and the food and the tent.
Yeah, that's right. But it's a pretty small amount compared, because they'll take in like $30,000 on that night.
Okay.
And then those tents are cheap. I mean, you can get one of those tents for less than $50.
I came in late, I'm sorry, I was trying
That's
to
okay.
find the building, well, not the building, the room. Both, actually. So you might have said this, but I'm sort of, to follow up, I'm counting the number of people you mentioned who are participating. In your instance, there are 300. But, I mean, in practical terms, how often does one host a party, and how
They
many
say
years
three,
does it take
3 years.
for
They
you
say
to get? It's a
3 years.
three-year
If you're doing it
cycle.
at a healthy pace, you can do it like once every 3 years.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So
You
it
might have
is
answered that already.
close to 100. It's 100. Roughly, you would expect to attend 100 parties a year.
Mhm.
So it's pretty intense. You don't necessarily have to attend them all. You can send your
Send a
son or something to
representative,
go for you. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's going to take you 3 years to get.
Yeah, most of them, if
Hopefully your
they
money
start
back in a
fresh,
way.
they would. If you join, like the question earlier about how you get into this circle, you just decide to do it basically.
Mhm.
So you just sort of
Right.
ask somebody to invite you to their
Future
party,
gains
and then
sort
you
of
start
expectation.
doing it from there.
Yeah.
But you have to make that investment, so
Yeah.
that's the big obstacle, really. And then the reward to that, the men who do it, they want to be known as blâtèr, or even the Indonesian word bajingan, in Madurese bajingan. They call themselves that, and it's used like they use it themselves, and then people in Eastern Madura, where they mostly don't like the Remo tradition at all. In Eastern Madura, they think it's like ruining the reputation of Madurese people, which is pretty true. But they'll call them bajingan, and then the men who are in it will also call themselves bajingan, and they kind of adopt the term bajingan. Right? It's like a rascal or something. It's like bajingan.
Yeah, or worse.
Yeah. Yeah.
You make a lot of comparisons to the mafia. Do you compare any, works from like Cavalleria Rusticana or any like Italian operas or?
Oh, I never
that
thought about that.
reference a similar kind of exchange?
I've looked at some,
within-
anthropological studies
Yeah.
of bad man stories and bad man lore, and then mafia. There's quite a bit of anthropological study of mafias. So I've looked at that. I've never thought about looking at through the arts, or representations of it through the arts. That would be an interesting thing to do.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve, for a very, very interesting